Why have I asked my HVAC guy I found on Angie.com to change my grandpa's trachea tube? I was so amazed at how he replaced our air ducts. I knew I could trust him to change Pop-Pop's tube.
I think we should call a doctor.
Angie, the one you trust to find the ones you trust. Find pros for all your home projects at Angie.com.
Have you ever heard of the 1977 novel Runestruck? It's a fun little piece of satirical fiction by the American author Calvin Trillin. It explores the mania that consumes a small town in Maine after a gas station attendant and his pal discover what they describe as this real weird rock while they're out clamming. Upon further inspection, the rock seems to be inscribed with an ancient Norse rune. The president of the local amateur archaeological society is alerted, and he's immediately convinced that not only is the runestone an authentic Viking artifact, it proves that the little town of Berryville, Maine, was once visited by the Norse explorer Leif Erikson in the 11th century. You see, in the Norse sagas, there are tales of a beautiful and fertile territory located somewhere southwest of Greenland. This place was dubbed Vinland, or the Land of Wine, because of the wild grapes that allegedly grew there in abundance. According to the medieval sources, Leif Erikson and a handful of other Norse seafarers made the journey to Vinland in the early 11th century. There, they collected resources, traded, and fought with the local people they called the Skrælings. Despite the great resources of Vinland, it was eventually abandoned by the Norse, and its existence became a distant memory, bordering on myth. In the mind of Calvin Trillin's eager amateur archaeologist, this mysterious rune confirmed that Berryville was undoubtedly Vinland. News of the rune and Berryville's Viking history very quickly becomes the talk of the town. Before the rune can be properly authenticated, local boosters have already seized on the chance to reinvent their quiet seaside town as a Viking-themed tourist destination. An architect is brought in to completely reimagine the town's beachside parks, proposing an elaborate Viking village and beach recreation area. The local cafe is redubbed Leif's Lair. The town throws a massive runestone festival that attracts national television coverage. The local newspaper even changes its motto to "Where the Seed Was Planted" to signal Berryville's newfound historical gravitas. But not everyone is equally excited about Berryville's runestone. Millicent Dufferin, the president of the Berryville Historical Society, is deeply committed to the idea that a Dufferin, one of her august ancestors, was actually the first person in town. The Italian-American Historical Preservation Society deeply objects to anyone diminishing the legacy of Christopher Columbus. Amateur historians face off against self-taught runeologists who face off against hypocritical big-city summer people who don't want their quaint summer getaway turned into Viking land. Not in my backyard. In Runestruck, dubious historical claims clash against one another, while the opportunistic just hope to cash in. The novel is a good-natured satire of small-town politics and the amiable quirks of northern New Englanders. It also features a dog named Full Frontal Nudity, which I thought was kind of funny. When the book was released, it was reviewed in the New York Times by lit critic Robert Strozier, who deemed the novel amusing despite being, quote, fairly predictable and having, quote, some running gags and bits of business in there that do run on, end quote. Despite enjoying the hook of the novel, by the end of his review, Strozier expressed a bit of exasperation with the entire premise of Runestruck, writing, quote, I mean, what difference does it make whether Leif Erikson or Columbus or St. Brendan or Pliny the Elder or whoever the hell else is in the running got here first? Here we all are on the landmass. Let's go with it, I say. End quote. Now, I see Strozier's point here. The debate around the first European on the continent can seem a little tedious, especially when you consider that millions of people had been living in the Western Hemisphere for tens of thousands of years before anyone popped in on a boat from Europe. But tedious or not, there's no denying that interest in this particular historical first has bred a certain type of obsessive amateur scholarship. I mean, how many times has it come up on this podcast? The New York Times reviewer seems to have missed that Calvin Trillin was parodying a very real archaeological controversy that had consumed the town of Phippsburg, Maine, just a few years previous. In 1971, a carpenter named Walter J. Elliott Jr. claimed that while exploring Phippsburg's Spirit Pond Nature Reserve, he had found 3 small rocks inscribed with what looked like Old Norse runes. Most remarkably, one of the runestone inscriptions seemed to be a crude map of Maine's coast, complete with a directional arrow and an inscription that could be translated as, quote, "to Canada in 2 days." That's Canada spelt with a K. The so-called Spirit Pond runestones were soon the talk of Maine. They even caught the attention of one Dr. Ole Landsverk, a physicist turned amateur runologist deeply committed to the idea of Viking first contact in the Americas. After Dr. Landsverk declared the runes authentic, the local paper started running editorials claiming that Phippsburg had originally been settled by the Vikings. Soon, the state of Maine was trying to acquire the Spirit Pond runestones from Mr. Elliott. Well, at first, the state demanded that they be returned because they had been allegedly discovered on state property. Elliott replied to that request with a now infamous letter that read, quote, "Just returned from Phippsburg, reburied stones on state land near site for some other fool to find. Disgustingly yours, Walter J. Elliott Jr." End quote. I love that. Now, despite this defiant bluster, Elliott did not actually rebury the stones. He was eventually encouraged to turn the stones over to the state of Maine after an anonymous donor gifted him $4,500. When the state of Maine eventually had the runestones examined by proper experts, they were very quickly revealed to be hoaxes. The Spirit Pond runestones had almost nothing in common with authentic engraved stones from Scandinavia. The runes themselves were a scrambled mess, completely inconsistent with 11th century Norse. One expert described the Spirit Pond stones as containing, quote, "a few Norse words in a sea of gibberish," end quote. The so-called map stone was the most obvious fake. There are no other stones engraved with maps that have been found anywhere in the territories of the ancient Norse. The stone also used the name Canada with a K to refer to the northern part of the North American continent. Canada was not a name that anyone used until the 1500s. The mapstone also suggested a knowledge of the modern political boundaries between Maine and New Brunswick that would have been completely meaningless to the 11th century Norse. On top of all that, and most damningly, a close inspection of the runestones showed that they had been etched with an electric steel engraving tool. In Runestruck, Calvin Trillin wasn't just poking fun at small-town Mainers. He was tapping into a unique obsession with America's origins. The Spirit Pond runestones fall into a long tradition of questionable Viking artifacts that have been found all over the United States. Some have even claimed that the Norse made their way as far west as modern Minnesota. When the Spirit Pond runestones made their appearance in 1971, it was on the heels of a fresh surge of interest in Viking expeditions to North America. Just a few years earlier, a 7-year excavation on Newfoundland's Northern Peninsula, led by archaeologist Anne Stein Ingstad, had uncovered enough physical evidence to finally settle the question of whether or not the Norse had made it west of Greenland. Ingstad's discoveries made it clear that the site known as Lonso Meadows had once been a Norse settlement and ship repair site in the 11th century. But as much as these archaeological findings confirmed that there was a Norse presence in northern Newfoundland, many questions remained. Even if you accounted for the differences in climate between the 11th and 20th centuries, Newfoundland's northern peninsula did not seem like it fit with the descriptions of the lush, warm, fertile country the medieval sources called Vinland, the land of wine. At no point in history were wild grapes growing in northern Newfoundland. Physical evidence of Norse contact may have been found in North America, but the question of Vinland's true location was far from settled. In the wake of these real archaeological discoveries, there came a clutch of other, far more questionable archaeological finds, like those from Spirit Pond. For a certain cadre of Americans, it wasn't enough that the Norse may have visited Baffin Island, northern Labrador, or Newfoundland. They were committed to the idea that Vinland had to be within the borders of the modern United States. The real archaeology inspired a fresh wave of speculation and emboldened some pranksters. From the very start, the story of the Norse in North America was defined by a complex mix of myth and history, fact and speculation, investigation, and imagination. The original sources for these journeys, the medieval Icelandic sagas, are pieces of literature that weave mythic story structures and supernatural elements into historical narratives. When Anglo-American audiences were introduced to these medieval sources in the 18th and 19th centuries, some became convinced that it was only a matter of time before we found the American Vikings. But the search for an American Vinland has been hounded by hoaxes, false leads, and a long ship's worth of fake history. Did the Norse end their voyages in Newfoundland, or is Lonso Meadows just the tip of the iceberg? What clues can be gleaned from the Icelandic sagas about the true location of Vinland? And can we trust anything from a text that features talking corpses and monsters with one giant foot? Let's see what we can find out today on Our Fake History. Episode number 244, How Far Did the Vikings Voyage? Part 1. Hello and welcome to Our Fake History. My name is Sebastian Major, and this is the podcast where we explore historical myths and try to determine what's fact, what's fiction, and what is such a good story it simply must be told. Before we get going this week, this is just another friendly reminder that you can hear this episode ad-free through Patreon. If you support at $5 or more every month, you get access to an ad-free feed and a ton of special extra episodes, including an upcoming show on the 7 wonders of the ancient world. That stuff is just for the patrons. So if you dig this show, you want to support us, then head over to patreon.com/ourfakehistory. Find a level of support that works for you. This week, we are turning our attention to a topic that has been on my to-do list since I first launched this podcast back in 2015. And that is the Viking presence in North America. On top of that, listeners have been requesting a show about the Vikings for years. As the patrons know, this very topic nearly won the most recent Patreon poll for the next extra episode. So the patrons could have had this topic all to themselves. But I'm not going to lie, I'm a little glad that it didn't win because I want to be able to do this one for everyone. Because this story is rich with fake history. Now, this begins with the fact that the Vikings are among some of the most misunderstood people to emerge from the medieval period. We're all familiar with the image of the stereotypical Viking. These are the bloodthirsty, fair-haired barbarians from Europe's far north who emerged from their dragon-headed longboats to pillage and burn any country that was unlucky enough to be in their path. I'm sure you can picture the cartoon Viking in your mind with his long flowing mustache and ubiquitous horned helmet. And if by some chance you don't know what I'm talking about, just check out the logo for the NFL's Minnesota Vikings. But as you probably already know, what I just described is largely a collection of exaggerations, misconceptions, and medieval propaganda. As you might expect, the story of the real medieval Norse is considerably more complex. Even the name Vikings might be a bit of a misnomer that has been clumsily applied to all seafaring Norse people. But more on that later. The point is that Vikings have always seemed like an obvious topic for our fake history, and yet I have been slow to engage with it. This is because over the years, I've felt like the Vikings have been exceptionally well covered by other historical media. There have been the successful TV shows like Vikings, Vikings Valhalla, Last Kingdom, and the comedy show Norsemen. Then, of course, there was the intense 2022 Robert Eggers film, The Northman. And oh man, if you haven't seen that one, check it out. Now, the historical accuracy of these films and TV shows has varied wildly, but I would argue that as a whole, they've brought more nuance to the popular understanding of the medieval Norse. I also feel like my fellow historical mythbusters have been on the case when it comes to the Norse. I feel like it's safe to assume that if you're the kind of person that listens to Our Fake History, you've probably already learned that the real Vikings did not wear horned helmets. I mean, just Google historical myths. It's like the first thing that comes up. At this point, I think horned helmets qualify as baby's first historical myth. So, honestly, I don't even really want to talk about that, but I guess I got to address it. If by some chance you do not know, the medieval Norse did not wear helmets with big, protruding horns. Real Viking helmets were far more simple and better suited for medieval battle. The idea that Vikings wore horned helmets comes from the 19th century and the operas of Richard Wagner. The Vikings and Nordic gods in Wagner's operas like The Ring Cycle wore horned and winged helmets. The popularity of these operas helped enshrine the image of the Vikings that we still have to this very day. In other words, the Minnesota Viking is an opera Viking. But As I've already pointed out, this is well-trodden territory. Helmets have always been of less interest to me than the impressive sea voyages of the medieval Norse. It's astounding that in the 10th century, Norse people managed to successfully colonize Greenland, and then eventually got a toehold in what is today Canada. With my listeners eager for a Viking show and Greenland very much back in the news, it seemed like a good time to finally engage with this history. As it turns out, the Viking presence in North America is one of those places where myth, history, and hoax intersect. The question of just how far the Norse managed to voyage touches on a great variety of things that I have defined as fake history on this podcast in the past. The original sources we have for these voyages are the medieval Icelandic texts known as the sagas, which are a fascinating mix of orally transmitted history, Nordic myth, and a syncretic mashup of pagan and Christian religion. Then there's the place that the Vikings would come to occupy in the historical imagination of a particular group of, let's call them Nordic curious Americans. Long before solid evidence was discovered of a Viking presence in North America, there were some in the United States who had become committed to the idea that America had been quote-unquote discovered by the Norse. This belief was often driven more by ideology and a specific type of eugenics-inspired romanticism than any proper historical research or archaeology. The desire to place what the Norse called Vinland, or the land of wine, in a particularly favorable and politically useful location has led to all manner of hoaxes and Viking-flavored frauds. There is a lot to unpack here, so strap in. This one is going to be a trilogy. Now, before we can really start engaging with the question of how ambitious the journeys of the Norse seafarers truly were, we need to understand some things about the people we call the Vikings. Who were these people, and how was it that they were in a position to visit North America nearly 500 years before any other Europeans? Also, should we even be calling these people the Vikings? Friends, we're gonna need some context, so let's get into it. Today's episode is being brought to you by Quince. A well-built wardrobe is about pieces that work together and hold up over time. That's what Quince does best. Premium materials, thoughtful design, and everyday staples that feel easy to wear and easy to rely on, even as the weather shifts. Quince has everyday essentials that you're going to love with quality that lasts. We're talking organic sweaters, polos for every occasion, lighter jackets that keep you warm in the changing seasons, and the list goes on. Quince works directly with top factories and cuts out the middlemen so you're not paying for brand markup, just quality clothing. Plus, they only partner with factories that meet rigorous standards for craftsmanship and ethical production. I got the opportunity to pick some stuff out from Quince, and I picked up this very cool double-brushed stretch overshirt jacket. It's kind of like somewhere between a jacket and a shirt. I love it. I'm wearing it all the time, and when we head into spring, I think it's going to be like my go-to jacket. I know this is an ad, but honestly, it's a really good jacket. I really like it. So, refresh your wardrobe with Quince. Go to quince.com/fakehistory for free shipping on your order and 365-day returns. Now available in Canada, too. You know I love that. That's QINCE.com/fake history. Free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/fake history. First, we should ask, who were the Vikings? Well, as Norse history buffs in the crowd could surely tell you, the term Viking is itself somewhat controversial, especially when it's used to broadly refer to all Scandinavian people from the early medieval period. The etymology of the term Viking is connected to the Old Norse word vik. Vik is a place on the western coast of Norway that is believed to have been the launching point for seaborne raiding parties starting in the 8th century. But the word vik can also simply mean bay. So the term may have originally meant raiders from Vik, or raiders from the bay, or maybe simply baymen. In early medieval Britain, the Old English equivalent for the word Viking came to be used for raiders who started marauding the coasts and sacking monasteries in the late 700s. But many experts, like archaeologist William Fitzhugh, have argued that the term Viking was more of a verb than a noun. Viking wasn't who you were, it was something you did. If someone was hopping in a longboat and was going raiding, they were going a Viking. In early Icelandic, we find the term Vikingar used to refer to people who grouped together in bands to raid from ships. Vikingar were often marauders and pirates, but sometimes the term was used to refer to people considered courageous or honorable. But not all seagoing folks from Nordic cultures were raiders or Vikings. The people who settled places like Iceland and Greenland were farmers looking for land, and as such, many have argued that it's inappropriate to refer to them as Vikings. So, unless we're specifically talking about bands of seagoing pirates and raiders, we should probably just use the term Norse to refer to the people who explored the northern Atlantic in the 11th century. Now, I don't mean to get overly pedantic about this. In practice, historians use the term Viking pretty liberally, especially when they're titling their books. Viking is the term that most people are familiar with, and it often gets used to refer to the medieval Norse, even by experts. But this would not be our fake history if I did not address this one fundamental misconception about these medieval people. The Vikings were Norse, but not all Norse were Vikings. Now, despite this, there's still a tendency to speak about a Viking Age, which, for all its potentially misleading connotations about the Norse, helps bracket a specific era in Northern European history. Traditionally, the Viking Age has been dated from 793 AD or CE, whichever you like, to 1066. Now, interestingly, both of these dates have a way of centering Britain in the Norse story. 793 was the date of the infamous raid on the Lindisfarne Monastery, located on a small island off the northeast coast of England, or what was then Northumbria. This brutal attack was done by seaborne raiders, or Vikings, from Scandinavia. Now, 1066 was the year of the famous Battle of Hastings, when England was conquered by the Normans. The Normans, or Northmen, were a Norse-descended people who had absorbed French language and culture after a few generations living in Normandy. The Viking Age begins with a raid on Britain and then ends with Britain's ultimate conquest. But the idea is that by the time you get to 1066, the Norse had gone through a cultural transformation. But let's start at the beginning. We should ask, was the 793 Lindisfarne attack truly the first Viking raid? Well, probably not. But it was a particularly well-documented and much discussed raid by the literate people of the time. As such, Lindisfarne was the first Viking attack that made a significant mark on the historical record. The next few centuries saw these types of seaborne raids becoming more and more common throughout Europe and the British Isles. The original Norse homelands were roughly centered around the modern nations of Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. But after Lindisfarne, the Norse started pushing out beyond their traditional territories. This sometimes took the form of Viking raids, but not always. Just as many Norse people started voyaging to faraway lands as traders, farmers, and settlers. Viking expeditions were often followed by more peaceful waves of Norse immigration. Not long after Lindisfarne, the Shetland and Orkney Islands were occupied and used as launching points for future raids on Scotland, Ireland, and England. Within a few decades, much of Northern and Western Europe had been reshaped by the Norse. Expert Annette Kolodny summarized it like this, quote, "Eventually, between Norwegian and Danish Vikings, whole swaths of England and places like Dublin in Ireland, York in England, and Normandy in France became Nordic territories, home to burgeoning populations of mixed local and Scandinavian origins. Those who had once gone a Viking now became landowners and farmers, like their forebears in Denmark and Norway." End quote. There's a historical tradition that has emphasized the violence of the Viking Age. The Vikings themselves became medieval boogeymen who were said to tower over their neighbors and attacked with animal-like bloodlust. This has inspired a long-running debate amongst medievalists concerning just how violent the Vikings truly were. Now, if I'm not careful here, I could spend the rest of this episode unpacking all of these arguments. But suffice it to say, there are many medieval sources that attest to the ferocity of the Norse attacks during this period. However, many historians have pointed out that while that violence cannot be denied, the Vikings were not especially bloodthirsty when compared to their medieval neighbors. The historian Simon Coupland has argued that, quote, "In the Middle Ages, the Vikings were regularly portrayed as brutally cruel, devilishly cunning, and of superhuman stature." End quote. However, according to Coupland, a close examination of the evidence reveals that all three stereotypes, quote, "contained a grain of truth, but led to exaggeration and distortion in later medieval texts, and even some 9th century sources. In some, tales of tall, treacherous, and brutal Northmen can be shown to have grown in the telling, and there is an evident gap between the Vikings of myth and the Vikings of history." End quote. Put simply, Viking raids were brutal, but all medieval warfare was brutal. The Vikings were not especially bad in this regard. The story of the Norse is equally about settlement, trade, and integration with local populations, as much as it is about violent raids. This integration with other peoples around Europe meant that by the late 9th century, Norse culture had absorbed elements from Celtic, Frankish, Brittonic, and Slavic culture, just to name a few of the inputs. This is just another friendly reminder that the story of humanity is the story of mixing, evolution, and cultural exchange. But it's worth asking, what exactly inspired the aggressive Norse expansion of the early medieval period? Well, there are a number of good hypotheses, but it seems like it was a combination of economic, political, and demographic pressures. Most scholars now seem to reject the idea that Norway and Denmark simply became overpopulated in this period, and as a result, the Norse were pushed to start raiding. There is evidence to suggest that farmland was becoming more scarce in these regions during those centuries, especially in Norway. But the reason for this may have been more political than demographic. As powerful lords and would-be kings were consolidating and centralizing their authority in Norway, land was being redistributed. This displaced many local chieftains and freemen who had previously held land. These were the types of folks who took to Viking raids. But interestingly, one of the byproducts of those raids was exploration and a deeper understanding of geography. Viking raiders learned of new lands on their expeditions, which eventually became of interest to Norse colonists more interested in establishing farms than robbing monasteries. Unpopulated or lightly populated territories that could sustain agriculture were, by the mid-9th century, very attractive to Norse people, especially those who had been displaced by conflict. Now, this brings us to an essential aspect of both the Viking Age and the journeys of exploration that are at the heart of this series: Norse maritime technology. As the historian Anders Winroth has pointed out, quote, "If early medieval Scandinavians had not become exquisite shipwrights, there would have been no Vikings and no Viking Age." End quote. Good point, Anders. The geography of the region had made shipping a part of Scandinavian culture for centuries before the so-called Viking Age. But by the late 8th century, Norse shipbuilding had progressed to the point where people from Scandinavia had arguably the most seaworthy vessels in all of Europe. Both the warships and the more humble merchant vessels were built using what is known as a clinker or lopstrake hull construction. This construction method involved thick oak keels and overlapping layers of thinly cut wooden planks. This layering method made the ships both exceptionally strong and unusually light for the era. This meant that the Norse ships were both quite large and quite versatile. There are many descriptions of Norse longboats carrying upwards of 100 warriors. That was a lot for the medieval period. The ships were also outfitted with oarlocks that were fairly sophisticated for the era. These allowed the ships to be rowed at a great variety of angles. The oars could also be more easily stowed when the ships were under sail. Most importantly for our story, Norse ships tended to fare considerably better in the open ocean when compared to many contemporary ship designs. This technological advantage also likely inspired the era of raiding. Put simply, they had the ships, so they used them. But this same technology also made the subsequent periods of exploration and colonization possible. It's also worth noting that the seafarers of this era benefited from a helpful climate. The Viking Age falls within what climatologists call the medieval warm period, or the medieval climate optimum. This was a period of a few centuries when temperatures were, on average, a little bit warmer, especially when compared to the so-called Little Ice Age, which followed this period. Now, the data seems to suggest that this warming did not affect the entire planet, but it most certainly affected the northern Atlantic Ocean. Between the late 800s and the early 1200s, seafarers in the North Atlantic would have encountered less sea ice, fewer storms, and relatively calmer seas. It also made places like Iceland and Greenland a bit more amenable to medieval agriculture. Now, I don't want to give the impression that sailing the North Atlantic was easy in a Norse longship a millennium ago. It was not. But the climate gave the medieval Norse a fighting chance. The cooling climate in later centuries also helps explain why these journeys became less common in the late medieval period. Around the year 870, the first Norse settlers arrived on the distant island of Iceland with the intention of staying permanently. Now, interestingly, there may have been a group of Irish monks who actually made it to Iceland before the first large wave of Norse settlers. But for all intents and purposes, Iceland was uninhabited when those settlers arrived. These folks were mostly farmers who had left Norway in hopes of finding a place where farmland was not as hotly contested. Among those early settlers were Norse chieftains who had found themselves pushed out of Norway during the ongoing wars associated with the rise of the Fair Hair dynasty in that country. In its first century as an outpost of Norse culture, Iceland became a fairly attractive destination for many in the North Atlantic world. Soon, these settlers from Norway were joined by immigrants from Ireland, Britain, and other Nordic colonies. By the end of the 10th century, the swelling population of the island nation meant that once again, good farmland was becoming scarce. Despite its size, Iceland's famously volcanic geology meant that only the coastal areas could reliably sustain agriculture. So as the year 1000 approached, you once again had Norse seafarers looking even further afield to hopefully find uninhabited lands. Now, for the rest of this series, we're going to be evaluating exactly how far afield the Norse actually managed to get. But Iceland is an important piece of this puzzle. Iceland would become the jumping-off point for many of the subsequent voyages that we're going to explore. The people involved in these voyages would also become deeply important to the history of Iceland. In fact, if it had not been for the people of Iceland, these voyages may have been entirely forgotten. This is because the Icelanders did more than any other people to preserve the unique Norse oral traditions known as the sagas. Now, as I've already hinted, the sagas are an essential source for this particular series. So it's worth discussing them a little bit before we dive into their contents. The word saga is related to the English word to say. So the sagas might originally translate to what is said. These were orally transmitted stories that were part history, part genealogy, and part entertainment. They were used to celebrate the great deeds of prestigious ancestors and draw connections between those ancestors and those who were currently living. The sagas were often recited from memory at public events. In fact, as the Christian church became more dominant in Iceland, reciting the sagas became one of the few forms of entertainment that were officially encouraged by the authorities. Apparently, the Icelandic church did not want people to dance, so it was story time with the sagas. As such, the sagas, which were part of Norse culture throughout Europe and beyond, gained an even greater cultural significance in Iceland. Starting in the mid-11th century, Icelandic churchmen started writing down the sagas. Now, there are some sagas that were written in Norway and other parts of the Nordic world, but the vast majority of them came from Iceland. These Icelandic authors were clerics trained in ecclesiastical schools who were combining, revising, and redacting oral traditions that had existed for generations. This means that the sagas are messy sources if you're reading them looking for what we might call historical facts. These texts also document a point in history when Christianity was still new in the Norse world. As such, they reflect a fascinating mix of pagan Norse culture and later Christian culture. These worldviews sit somewhat uneasily beside one another in these texts. Supernatural elements reflecting Norse pagan traditions sometimes appear in the sagas in ways that can be startling and a bit confusing for a modern reader. Corpses are reanimated and speak prophecies. Ghostly voices appear from nowhere. Strange phantoms and doppelgangers arrive unexpectedly. Strange, sometimes magical creatures appear as both friends and foes. A saga can start out as a sober recitation of a family genealogy and then can pivot sharply into a tale about fighting a troll. On top of all of that, the sagas had a way of evolving and changing over time. As saga translators Magnus Magnusson and Herman Paulson have explained, quote, "The sagas were never museum pieces, embalming for all time a literary act. They were living things, and later generations thought nothing of adapting and rewriting them to suit changing tastes." End quote. All of this is to say that while the sagas are a unique and beautiful part of world literature that contain irreplaceable insights into early Norse culture, they're also infamously difficult to parse when you're hunting for what we might call hard facts. And yet, it is with the sagas that we must start if we're going to figure out just how far west the Norse managed to travel. The two relevant sagas are the Icelandic texts known as the Saga of the Greenlanders and the Saga of Eric the Red. Together, they are sometimes known as the Vinland sagas. Both of these sagas tell the tale of the colonization of Greenland, and then subsequent journeys to places the Norse called Helluland, Markland, and Vinland. It's likely that all of these places were in North America, but exactly where is still up for debate. The other tricky thing is that these two sagas tell different stories about the first encounters with these new lands and the subsequent attempts to establish Norse colonies. Which saga should we believe? Well, let's take a closer look at these texts. What clues do they give us about the locations of these mysterious places? And do the sagas have anything to teach us about first contact between Europeans and indigenous North Americans? Well, let's take a quick break and we'll dive in. Today's episode of Our Fake History is being brought to you by Rosetta Stone. Are any of you out there planning to travel this year? I know at least a few of you are. Well, imagine going into that trip actually understanding the language. Rosetta Stone helps you feel more confident, more connected, and way less like a tourist. Rosetta Stone has been the trusted leader in language learning for over 30 years. Their immersive, intuitive method helps you truly pick up your new language naturally. No memorizing random vocabulary lists, no feeling lost. Now, as you've probably heard, I'm going to Greece this year with a bunch of listeners. And before I go, I'm going to try and learn some Greek with Rosetta Stone. I'm also pumped to use their true accent feature to really get my pronunciations locked down. Don't wait. Unlock your language learning potential now. Our Fake History listeners can grab Rosetta Stone's lifetime membership for 50% off. Yeah, that's a lifetime membership. It's incredible. That's unlimited access to 25 language courses for life. Visit rosettastone.com/history to get started and claim your 50% off today. Go to rosettastone.com/history and start learning today. Today's episode of Our Fake History is being brought to you by Homes.com. If you've ever been in the market for a new home, you know home shopping can be a lot. There's so much you don't know and so much you need to know. What are the neighborhoods like? What are the schools like? Who's the agent who knows the listing or neighborhood best? And why can't all this information just be in one place? Well, now it is on Homes.com. They've got everything you need to know about the listing itself, but even better, they've got comprehensive neighborhood guides and detailed reports about local schools. And their agent directory helps you see the agent's current listings and sales history. Homes.com collaboration tools make it easier than ever to share all this information with your family. It's a whole cul-de-sac of home shopping information all at your fingertips. Homes.com. We've done your homework. The two sagas that tell of voyages west of Greenland are the Saga of the Greenlanders and the Saga of Eric the Red. Scholars like Magnusson and Paulsen have argued that the Saga of the Greenlanders was probably written down first, and the Saga of Eric the Red came later. Now, experts have a hard time precisely dating the Saga of the Greenlanders, but we're pretty sure that the Saga of Eric the Red was written down around the mid-1200s. Now, there's disagreement about what that means. Magnusson and Paulsen believe that the Saga of Eric the Red may have been a deliberate revision of the earlier Saga of the Greenlanders. This revision may have been done because those later writers had, quote, better access to information about the major characters involved, end quote. So, just because that saga was written down later doesn't necessarily mean it's less accurate. But other scholars, like Gisli Sigurdsson, believe that these sagas were composed entirely independently of one another and drew on the constantly evolving oral traditions that were circulating in Iceland. The point is, these two sagas are quite different, and it's hard to know which one is more accurate. The best place to start, I think, is with the Saga of the Greenlanders. This will help us establish the key beats of the Vinland story. Then in the next part of this series, we'll look at those spots where the Saga of Eric the Red differs. Now, what you're going to get here is the Sebastian Major summary of the Greenlanders saga, with a particular focus on the voyages that may have brought the Norse to North America. I'm going to be drawing on both the Magnusson and Paulsen translation and the Arthur Middleton Reeves translation of the saga, if you're curious where the quotes are coming from. Now, both of the relevant sagas fall into a subgenre that the experts call family sagas, as they're structured around the genealogy of one or two central families. In both cases, the family of the 10th century Norseman Eric the Red takes center stage. The saga of the Greenlanders begins around the year 960. After a series of killings in Norway, a man named Thorvald and his son Eric the Red, called that because of his distinctive red hair, are forced into exile. They resettle in Iceland, which by that time was already fairly well populated. When he comes of age, Eric is revealed to have the same temperament as his father. He simply cannot peacefully live beside his neighbors. After getting into a dispute and killing a man named Eyjolf the Foul, great name, Eric the Red, like his father before him, is also banished, this time to a small island. When Eric the Red is eventually allowed to return to Iceland, he almost immediately gets into another quarrel with a neighbor that leads to the equivalent of a small medieval gang war on the island. To resolve things, the local assembly deemed Eric the Red an outlaw and banished him from the country for another 3 years. Eric the Red now needed somewhere else to live, and his family had been deemed too disruptive for both Norway and Iceland. So he decided that he was going to settle an entirely new country. A few years earlier, a fellow Icelander had spotted some land while sailing west, but he had never explored it. So it was that sometime around 981, Eric the Red, his wife, and a boatload of companions, both men and women, set out to find somewhere new to call home. They sailed westward and eventually found the land that had been spotted years before. Eric the Red and his companions then spent the next 3 years exploring the territory, determining that it was uninhabited. He then made the decision to name the country Greenland, quote, for he believed that people would be much more tempted to go there if it had an attractive name, end quote. Now, I'll admit, I had heard that Greenland's name had been chosen as a way to trick people into thinking that it was a lot less glacial than it actually is. But honestly, I had always assumed that that had to be a historical myth. But no, it's in the sagas. Eric the Red wanted settlers in his new country, so he pulled the oldest trick in the real estate book, and he gave the place a splashy name. A place even colder and less hospitable than Iceland would become Greenland. Now, the other thing that I find remarkable about this was that Greenland was reportedly uninhabited. When I read this, I found myself asking, wait, did they just write the Inuit out of this story? It turns out, no, not in this case. Proto-Inuit Arctic cultures were not present in southern Greenland at this time. Archaeology has shown that these cultures were present in the very north of Greenland, but people from those cultures did not make their way to the south for another few centuries. It was in the 1200s when Arctic peoples first made their way to southern Greenland. Anyway, after his 3-year banishment was up, Eric returned to Iceland and started spreading the word about this amazing new country called Greenland. Eventually, 25 ships worth of settlers decided to join Eric the Red in this new colony. But thanks to rough seas, only 14 of these ships finally made it there. After this first proper wave of immigration, which likely occurred around the year 985, the focus of the saga shifts and centers on the children of Eric the Red. The founder and de facto chieftain of Greenland was said to have 3 sons, Leif, Thorvald, and Thorstein, and 1 daughter named Freydis. Now, of those children, the most famous is, without a doubt, Leif Erikson. Often, Leif is given credit for, quote-unquote, discovering the North American continent. But, interestingly, the medieval sources tell a slightly different story. In the saga of the Greenlanders, Leif Erikson is not the first person to spot land west of Greenland. The saga tells us that another Greenlander, a man by the name of Bjarni Herjolfsson, was blown off course while sailing west of Eric the Red's colony. After many days lost at sea, he eventually spotted a new, unfamiliar land, which, unlike the sparsely forested Greenland, was filled with dense forests. This was exciting because in Greenland, timber was a valuable commodity. But the saga tells us that Bjarni made the fateful choice not to go ashore and explore. Now, the writers of the saga clearly think that this was a terrible decision. We're told that Bjarni gets criticized by his crew, who think him an overly cautious coward. Then later we're told that stories of Bjarni's sightings get mentioned at the court of the Norwegian king, where once again he is mocked for his lack of curiosity. This might be why you have not heard the name Bjarni Herjolfsson, likely the first European to spot what is today Canada. The sagas assure us that he was an incurious coward. Honestly, I feel bad for Bjarni. Dude gets lost in the icy Labrador Sea and manages to get all his people home safe, and then he goes down in the sagas as some weak sauce explorer. Not fair. Justice for Bjarni. The saga tells us that after Bjarni returned to Greenland, he was visited by Leif Erikson, who was curious about reports that Bjarni had spotted a new land to the west. Leif learned as much as he could from Bjarni, and then assembled a crew and set out from Greenland with the intention of properly exploring these newly sighted lands. Now, in the Greenlander saga, Leif Erikson is presented as an unambiguous hero. He is brave, impetuous, and he cares about the welfare of his crew. Also, notably, he is Christian. You see, by this point, Christianity had made its way to Iceland and, by extension, Greenland. Eric the Red is notable because he resisted converting and remained committed to the pagan gods his entire life, even while his wife and children embraced Christianity. This might help explain why the sagas, which were written down by Icelandic churchmen, are a little more ambivalent about Eric the Red. His achievements are certainly celebrated in the texts, and his settlement of Greenland is presented as a great deed. But he's also presented as violent, difficult, and a bit of a greasy salesman. I mean, even medieval Icelanders seem to recognize that Greenland was a bit of a cheeky name. Eric the Red's lifelong devotion to gods like Odin and Thor likely did not score him points with the Christian scribes who later committed the sagas to writing. But Leif Erikson, on the other hand, is presented as an unambiguously great person. This is especially true in the saga of the Greenlanders, where he is described as possessing all of his father's good qualities and none of the bad. Now, interestingly, Eric's daughter, Freydis, is described as being the embodiment of all of Eric's bad traits. But she may have been done dirty by the authors of the saga. This might be another lying sex witch situation, but we will return to her a little later on in this series. Leif's voyage to the southwest of Greenland is described as being glorious all the way through. After a few days at sea, he and his crew spotted land and went ashore. This first landing place is described in the sagas as being, quote, covered with great glaciers, and between glaciers and shore, the land was like one great slab of rock, end quote. Because of this, Leif declares that this place shall be known as Helluland, which translates literally to rock slab land. Now, many archaeologists believe that Helluland may have been Baffin Island, or the most northerly part of what is today Labrador. Both of those places are glacial rock slab lands. But the saga writers are interested in underscoring just how much better Leif Erikson is than poor old Bjarni Herjolfsson. They report that after naming Helluland, Leif declares, quote, "Now we have done better than Bjarni. We have at least set foot on this new land." End quote. Rude, Leif. Rude. After deciding that Helluland was more or less worthless, the crew loaded back into the ship and continued sailing. After a few more days at sea, they spotted more land and once again went ashore to investigate. This place was very heavily forested. Impressed with the timber, Leif dubbed the territory Markland, or Forest Land. This may have been what is today southern coastal Labrador or part of Quebec, but of course, this is just a guess. After a short exploration, the crew once again returned to the ships and continued to sail. Now, unfortunately, the sources do not tell us exactly how long the crew was at sea for, but eventually they landed in a warm, beautiful country with long, sandy beaches and lush, grassy fields. This was a place of abundance. The saga describes it like this, quote, "There was no lack of salmon there, either in the river or in the lake, and larger salmon than they had ever seen before. The country seemed to be possessed of such good qualities that cattle would need no fodder during the winters. There was no frost there in the winters, and the grass withered very little. The days and nights were of nearly equal length than in Greenland or Iceland. On the shortest day of winter, the sun was up between mid-morning and mid-afternoon." End quote. Deciding that they could not possibly find a better place to spend the winter, the crew then went ashore and immediately got to work building houses. In future parts of the saga, this little settlement would be referred to as Leif's houses. And just when they thought things could not get any better, a member of the crew, a man named Tiker, discovered wild grapes growing nearby. Because Tiker was originally from the Rhineland region of Germany, he tells the crew that he knows grapes when he sees them. The discovery of the grapes was very exciting. So Leif Erikson dubbed the new country Vinland, or the Land of Wine. For the 11th century Norse, wine was considered a bit of a luxury. So a territory with grapes was acknowledged as being very special indeed. Now, these descriptions of Vinland have fascinated historians and amateur Viking hunters ever since. But the challenging thing about all of this is that Helluland and Markland both sound like Arctic or subarctic places. But Vinland sounds like somewhere considerably further south. Not only are there wild grapes growing in this place, but it's described as having a frostless winter. The length of the day also does not vary much between winter and summer, as opposed to the higher latitudes when summer days are very long and winter days are very short. So, how far was Vinland from Markland? Well, this is where we have to consider the very real possibility that these descriptions of Vinland are exaggerations. I mean, Greenland is called Greenland after all. That's generous even when we account for the medieval warm period. But the descriptions of Markland and Helluland seem so reasonable. Why would the sagas all of a sudden shift gears and become unreliable in their geographic descriptions? Well, that's a question we're going to return to throughout this series. You see, it's not out of the question for the sagas to suddenly shift gears. And helpfully, this is exemplified by the description of the second voyage to Vinland. After spending a fairly pleasant winter in Vinland, Leif Erikson and his crew loaded their ship with timber, grapes, and any other riches of Vinland that they could carry with them and sailed back to Greenland. Upon his return, Leif was dubbed Leif the Lucky and was feted as a returning hero. Now, after the Greenlanders were wowed with tales of Vinland, Leif's brother, Thorvald, decided that he too would like to go and visit this land of plenty. So, after assembling a crew and borrowing Leif's ship, Thorvald set off for Vinland. After an untold time at sea, we're told that Thorvald and his crew reached Leif's houses. Thorvald wintered there, but Leif's brother was keen to find a land that he could claim as his own. So he used the Vinland houses as a base from which he could do some further exploring. Thorvald eventually came to an area that reminded him of Norway. There was a long fjord abutted by high cliffs, surrounded by thick forests. Now, the descriptions of this fjord further complicate the potential geography of Vinland. Where was this place with both wild grapes and fjords? But before Thorvald could establish himself in this new land, the Norse had their very first encounter with Vinland's original inhabitants. Now, this is significant because if we trust this account in the saga of the Greenlanders, then this was the very first time in history when indigenous North Americans made contact with Europeans. In the sagas, the local people of Vinland are called Skrælings. Later Icelandic writers would eventually use that term to describe Inuit or Proto-Inuit Arctic peoples. In this way, Skræling was the medieval Norse term for a whole swath of North America's first people. Now, Skræling is not a complimentary name. It translates roughly to little wretches or wretches who screech. It's not exactly clear, but the screeching seems to be a reference to the battle cries of the indigenous people that the Norse encountered. But even that is a bit of a guess. So we should acknowledge that Skræling is a derisive term, and generally I do not like using derisive terms when referring to other cultures. But in the context of the sagas, we're forced to use the term Skræling as a bit of a placeholder because we do not conclusively know who these people were. Heck, we don't know if any of this stuff even happened. Now, there are some good guesses concerning the true identity of the Vinland Skrælings that we will discuss later on in the series. But for now, Skrælings is the term we are saddled with. But right off the bat here, Euro-Indigenous relations are not off to a great start. And Thorvald was about to make a particularly bad first impression. But as you'll hear, the description of this event is peppered with supernatural elements. This passage of the sagas is surreal and dreamlike, which raises questions about the reality of the event. We're told that after exploring this Norwegian-seeming fjord, Thorvald and his crew returned to their ship when they noticed something strange on a nearby beach. The saga tells us, quote, "They noticed 3 humps on the sandy beach just in front of the headland. When they went in closer, they found that these were 3 skin boats with 3 men under each one. Thorvald and his men divided forces and succeeded in capturing all of them, except one who escaped in his boat. They killed the 8 men and then returned to the headland from which they scanned the surrounding country. They could make out a number of humps further up the fjord, and determined that these were settlements." End quote. So already, this is a strange story. Thorvald and his crew find 9 of these so-called skraelings hiding under what they call skin boats. Now, it's possible that these were moose hide canoes. But why were these 9 guys hiding under their boats? This is unclear. Scholar Annette Kolodny has guessed that they may have been hunting and were using the canoes as something like a duck blind. But that's a guess. Then Thorvald and his crew just kill these men, unprovoked. There's no reason for this given in the saga. They just do it. But then the description gets even stranger. After spotting what seems to be an indigenous settlement in the distance, Thorvald and his crew are overcome with an almost magical drowsiness. We are told that they all fall asleep right there on the headland of the fjord. Then they are awoken by a ghostly voice that seems to echo out of the sky and says, quote, "Awake, Thorvald, you and all your company, if you want to save your life, and board your ship with all your men and sail from the land as fast as you can." End quote. Once awoken, Thorvald then noticed that the fjord was filled with skraelings in skin boats, angrily paddling towards them. These folks were likely told of the murders by the one man who managed to escape the Norse crew. Thorvald and his crew quickly retreated to their ship, where they set up their shields along the gunwale and got themselves into a defensive position. We're told that the skraelings shot at them with arrows from a distance for some time before they finally retreated. None of the Norse were hurt in the altercation except for Thorvald, who matter-of-factly tells his crew, quote, "I have been wounded in my armpit. An arrow flew between the gunwale and the shield, below my arm." End quote. This wound would ultimately prove fatal. Thorvald would die in Vinland, and according to the saga, he would receive the first Christian burial west of Greenland. So, what should we make of all this? Well, in this encounter, we get a taste of how the sagas incorporate Norse folklore. In Norse mythology, unexplainable magical sleeps overcome heroes all the time. These sleeping spells are sometimes sent by the gods or are conjured by other magical beings. This will become a bit of a theme in the sagas. Violent conflicts with the skraelings are often accompanied by supernatural occurrences, which suggest a type of skraeling magic. Annette Kolodny also suggests that the medieval Norse belief in a more magical world might also help explain Thorvald's violence towards the men that he discovered beneath the boats. Now, it's possible that these men were killed with the intention of keeping the Norse presence in Vinland hidden. Thorvald may have not wanted potentially hostile locals to know that he and his crew were there. The fact that a man got away meant that this plan totally backfired. But Kolodny also submits the possibility that the Norse may have been testing if these local people were magical creatures. She writes, quote, "The pre-Christian Norse inhabited a world of many different creatures who, like trolls or dwarves, could appear almost human. One way to distinguish the human from the non-human was the use of iron or steel weapons. Thorvald and his crew of anxious explorers may have felt the need to test the other's humanity with their swords and knives." End quote. Oh, whoa. That is a fascinating idea. If you come from a cultural context where trolls and other magical forest creatures are real, Would that encourage you to doubt the humanity of an unfamiliar group of people? Is that what happened in this particular instance? It's hard to know. And as always, the sagas do not offer many clues. Whatever explanation makes the most sense to you, there's still something tragic about the fact that the first recorded interaction between people from the different hemispheres is a violent interaction. If the sagas can be trusted, then the conflict between colonizers and indigenous people begins with Thorvald. When Vinland first appears in the saga of the Greenlanders, it's described as an idyllic land of plenty, a country far more hospitable than Greenland or even Iceland. But it very quickly becomes the site of tragedy. It loosely mirrors the biblical Garden of Eden. And just like the garden, Vinland would soon be lost to the Norse. Okay, that's all for this week. Join us again in 2 weeks' time when the saga will continue. I know I promised you stories about resurrected corpses and one-footed monsters. Believe me, they are coming. If you are listening to this on the day that it comes out, then there are only a few days left if you would like to join us in Greece this coming September. When I last checked, there were only 3 free spots still open on this trip. So if you want to get in on it, you gotta move fast. I'm so pumped that a lot of people signed up. It's going to be an amazing trip. But if you want one of those last 3 open slots, then head to ourfakehistory.com and follow the links for the trip to Greece, or go directly to johnshorestravel.com and follow the link for the Our Fake History trip to Greece. It's going to be amazing, and I'm glad that a lot of people signed up. I'm not going to lie, I'm pretty pumped about that. As always, before we go, I need to give some shout-outs to some very special people. Big ups to Jace Pauly, to Stephen Alex, to Staffan Bjorndell, to Simon Siger, to Ricardo Biella, to Aragon, to Ashley Fox, to Meet Not Andrew, to Carolina and Lannis Gonsalves, to Jeffrey McCurdy, and to Henriette. All of these folks have decided to pledge $5 or more on Patreon every month, so you know what that means. They are beautiful human beings. Thank you, thank you, thank you for your support. It means a lot. If you ever want to get in touch with me, I love hearing from the listeners. Please send me an email at ourfakehistory@gmail.com. You can find me on Facebook, facebook.com/ourfakehistory. You can find me on Instagram at ourfakehistory. You can find me on Blue Sky at ourfakehistory. I'm making all sorts of fun little short videos that you can find on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook. I've got a video coming out to celebrate Black History Month. Check them out there, or check them out on YouTube. Just go to YouTube, search for Our Fake History. As always, the theme music for this show comes to us from Dirty Church. Check out more from Dirty Church at dirtychurch.bandcamp.com. All the other music you heard on the show today was written and recorded by me. My name is Sebastian Major, and remember, just because it didn't happen doesn't mean it isn't real.
At Pluto TV, we're celebrating Black History Month with our free curated collection of Black entertainment.
No ifs, ands, or buts about it.
Catch award-winning films like Dreamgirls, Monsters Ball, and Selma.
We must make a massive demonstration.
Iconic hits like School Days and Set It Off. Plus full seasons of shows like Tyler Perry's Sisters and Power.
I got you.
It's star-studded brilliant Black entertainment, and it's all free.
It's getting good.
This month and always on Pluto TV. Stream now, pay never.